From the United States, the Wall Street Journal says UN rescinds invite to Iran and Syria talks as US balks. The United Nations, under intense pressure from the US and other countries, withdrew an invitation to Iran to participate in a Syria peace conference this week, a diplomatic bungle that muddled international efforts to end the civil war. The bruising, it describes it as a bruising international face-off before the talks began in Montreux before moving on to Geneva. Also from the US, the New York Times, talks over Syria are set to begin, but Iran is not invited. Describing US efforts to block the invite to Iran, the paper reports American officials said that Mr. Kerry, the US Foreign Secretary, had told Mr. Ban before his announcement that Iran needed to publicly endorse the goal of the meeting, the establishment of a transitional administration by mutual consent of the Assad government. Kerry was described as being furious over the invite. From France, Le Monde says, excluded, Iran doubts the chance of success at the Geneva II conference. Iran, which saw in the peace conference Geneva II the opportunity to assert its position on the Syrian conflict, has publicly expressed its doubts on the scope of the latter, just after having been rejected. A spokesman said the chances to end the war in Syria are not great without the participation of Iran. From Britain, the Independent reports on another front, MPs revolt over failure to admit Syrian refugees. The coalition government is under mounting pressure from Conservative and Liberal Democrat MPs to perform a U-turn to allow some Syrian refugees to come to Britain. Yvette Cooper, the Labour Shadow Home Secretary, told MPs Britain should not turn our backs on the crisis. Later, she dismissed the government's response to the question of refugees as being completely inadequate. Anindya, what chance do you think of these talks in Switzerland have of achieving any settlement in Syria?
Well, they haven't got off to a good start, have they? I mean, just looking at some of the words that jump out of the page here, bungled, a mistake although not a catastrophe. Well, that's good to know. I was struck by the understatement in Iran's official reaction, saying that the chances of success for these peace talks are not so great without the participation of Iran. I think that's fairly obvious. Well, what seems peculiar is just the sheer incompetence of the stage management, that you have Ban Ki-moon inviting Iran to these talks and then America uninviting them and then Russia kicking off about the uninvitation. And it does seem strange in that we have these talks that are meant to hope, the aim is to create a government by mutual consent involving Assad and some of the opposition forces, and the US seems to be arguing that Iran has to sign up to this goal in advance before it joins the talks, which well, at the very least, seems to be logically quite strange. You know,
and also it's strange because when Russia is participating in talks, Russia is not going to agree to the Assad government just committing suicide, is it?
Well, indeed not. Indeed not. I mean, the whole thing just basically. I mean, you look at the shape of the countries in that region, and the whole Sykes-Picot being drawn, the boundaries being drawn on the back of a napkin by the imperial powers, locked into a kind of chess game.
Back in 1916.
Indeed, and that's very much what you have now. But you have Russia and America and Iran as one of the sort of sub players. So yes, I mean to answer your question, I have fairly little faith that this is going to be of any use to the people of Syria or of the Middle East region. I mean, the UN's track record in intervening to sort these things out is a fairly dreadful one, and I imagine that certainly these kind of shenanigans suggest that there's not much hope for the people there from these particular talks.
And yet there's been quite a change. I mean, in mood music, if you like. I mean, 6 months ago from the United States, we had quite an aggressive stance that they were going to intervene. They were going to, Obama was set to launch cruise missiles against Damascus. And now it seems to have completely pulled back from this.
This is the irony, because for all the kind of cowboy talk, if you like, from America, the fact is, 10 years ago they launched the Project for a New American Century, and the idea was we re-engineer Iraq in order to diminish Iran Iran's influence. And of course that backfired completely. Iraq is effectively, the US could only stabilise it by bringing in, cutting a deal with Iraq. So, Iran rather. So, I wonder whether any of the imperial powers really knows what they want here. Because on the one hand, Syria's government, the Assad government, is clearly unstable and has lost the backing of the majority of people there. On the other hand, what else do you put in? I mean, if a popular government comes in Syria, then they might start complaining about the Golan Heights. How's that going to knock on in terms of the Shia population in Lebanon, the Palestinian question? These are all, it's not really in the interest of any of these powers to put a government in that people will like.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, also from Damascus, we have a report. Syrian officials are saying that actually they're talking to the Western security services about the problem of jihad, of Salafists, etc., inside Syria.
Well, indeed, and this links in with fears around migration, fears around so-called radicalisation and terrorism. I mean, I thought the Independent story about the argument over Syrian refugees being let into this country is kind of symptomatic there. If you think back, 150 years ago, next door, Europe was gripped by massive revolutions in 1848, and it was perfectly okay for refugees, activists, who knows what, to come over and pitch up in London. And now there's this kind of the war on terror, which is another continuity from the sort of 2002-2003 era, seems to...
It's an interesting point, because it seems, certainly in Europe at least, that the whole sort of war on terror and the question of immigration, refugees, have become coming up intermeshed.
Yes. And then this is, to me, I've been very interested in this question, how an Islamophobic, anti-Arab, anti-Iranian discourse that was fueled around the war on terror, has kind of morphed and become more of a classical racist ideology, very strong parallels with the sort of things that were said about Jews in Europe 100 years ago. Back then it was the notion of the anarchist or nihilist terrorist. Then there's also this concern over breeding, that these radical foreign elements are going to come over here and have lots of babies and turn the place sort of, It's astonishing, these kind of historical continuities.
Or even the claim that Europe is being Islamicized, that it's been taken over by
the Islamicization of Europe, which is a really kind of bizarre fantasy. And directly a retread of the sort of protocols of the Elders of Zion that you had 100 years ago.
I mean, just returning back to Iran, I mean, this week we've seen Iran make really fundamental concessions on its nuclear program and talk of lifting of sanctions. So at one level we have America and Iran doing a deal on this. Seems to be going well, but on the other, we suddenly have John Kerry furious that Ban Ki-moon's inviting Iran. There doesn't seem a consistency here.
I think it is inconsistent, but the saber rattling over Iran's nuclear project has always been, subordinated to America's imperial interests in there. There is a nuclear power in the Middle East already, we should point out, and strangely doesn't seem to be a problem. So.
Yeah, and there are actually a nuclear power on the other side of Iran and Pakistan.
Quite. Yes.
I mean, thank you very much. We're now going to return to our next story, which concerns the growing gap between rich and poor globally, and a report published by Oxfam this week. From Australia, the Sydney Morning Herald, richest 85 boast same wealth as half the world. 85 people control the same amount of wealth as half the world's population. That is 85 people compared to 3.5 billion. It shows the world's ultra-wealthy have not only recovered from the global financial crisis, they have positively blossomed. From the UK, the Metro says, a busload of rich have the same wealth as 3.5 billion poor. Oxfam's executive director, Win Bin Yami, said, it's staggering that in the 21st century, half of the world's population, that's 3.5 billion people, own no more than a tiny elite whose numbers could all fit comfortably in a double-decker bus. We cannot hope to win the fight against poverty without tackling inequality. From India, the Economic Times says, world's rich threaten democracy, says Oxfam in pre-Davos report. The world's elite have rigged laws in their own favour, says Oxfam, undermining democracy and creating a chasm of inequality across the globe. Oxfam said it in advance of the annual get-together of the world's most powerful at Davos in Switzerland. From the United States, Time magazine says, one stat to destroy your faith in humanity. The world's 85 richest people and as much as 3.5 billion poorest. The report from Oxfam calls on the government to crack down on international tax dodgers and invest in public investments such as healthcare, as well as implement progressive taxes and eradicate opaque political structures that encourage cooperation. It says, the world's super elite have gathered in Davos where they are warning that financial inequality threatens to undermine social stability and security on a global scale. The Washington Times from America reports on the world's richest individuals sparks call for universal health care. Researchers from Oxfam are using the report to call for the world's wealthiest to refrain from using their money to seek political gain. And they're advocating companies to shine more intense light on their revenue dealings and record books, and from governments around the world to use tax revenues to provide universal health care. I mean, when I was 6-7 years into the biggest financial crisis the world has seen since the 1930s, and at the end of that, here we have this report that 85 people in the world own more wealth than 3.5 billion. It's truly shocking. It's
astonishing. I mean, everyone's aware of inequality. It's difficult not to be, but every now and then a statistic comes along like this that, you know, you kind of think that this is the sort of thing that the Day-to-Day, Chris Morris's show, parodied in 1992, this kind of ludicrous, almost caricature of 85 people in one pan of the scale and 3.5 billion, which is a number you can't actually imagine in the other. I mean, you know, this is the pattern. You know, ever since the neoliberalism has seen steadily rising equality across the globe for several decades now. But it's like someone has just hit the gas pedal on it. I was looking at the so-called recovery that we're having in this country, and of course, it's property prices is the main motor. But you look at the graph, and it's specifically London, where property prices are zooming into the air. This is driven by a very, very small private foreign investor market. Essentially, it's a tax break. So global high net worth individuals are parking their money in London property. And this is boosting the prices, whereas everywhere else in the country, things are just flat. So even on a basic thing like that, the rich are getting richer and the poor are taking the blame.
And the other thing that's interesting, I mean, 30, 40 years ago, 100 years ago, when you talked about the world's elite, there may have been a world's elite. It was centred in Europe and North America and Japan to a lesser extent.
And there were national elites, whereas now we're looking at transnational elites.
But the other thing that's interesting, when you're of families from India originally, we're not just talking a rich elite now in Europe and North America. I mean, India is a case in point.
Yes, and China, of course. Though you know, it'd be interesting. Of course, even these famous newly embourgeoified middle class Chinese and Indian families with their Tata cars and what have you, that we hear so much. You know, they're nowhere near. They're essentially no different from a street beggar as far as these 85 people are concerned, you know, which gives you a sense of the scale of it. What interested me about this, though, was the way that the political conclusions that were drawn, which is a sort of kind of nostalgia for something that we would have thought was quite obvious, that you have universal health care, that the state intervenes to get some money from these obscenely rich people and provide things to, the other half of the population, which was a post-war settlement in the West, was viewed as, classic social democratic reforms. And now it just seems like this impossible utopia. I mean, the way that Oxfam's talking, there might be, writing a science fiction novel about this this perfect future world. Just this simple thing of universal healthcare that will do so much to tackle this issue. where is that on the political agenda? Even though the vast majority of people, both in America and across the world, would support.
I mean, that's interesting. What you pointed to is a sea change. I mean, for 3 decades after the Second World War, at least in Europe and to a certain extent North America, there was that consensus there had to be a welfare state to some degree. That was ripped up really in the course of the 1980s and 1990s, wasn't it?
Yes, and I think it's taken on a particularly intense form now, because I mean the key thing about the global financial crisis that exemplified by Lehman Brothers in 2008 is that the rulers of the world, the people who run the world on behalf of this 85, have no idea what to do about it. So in America they're trying this various kind of fancy pseudo-Keynesian quantitative easing. In Britain, I get the impression that people in charge just haven't got a Scooby, so they're just pilfering. Slang
for not having an idea.
haven't got a clue, yes. They don't know what to do, and they're just stuffing their back pockets for their mates and in the city, as far as I can see. I mean, that might look like a crude analysis, but it seems to me very much what's happening at the moment.
And here we have this annual gathering in Davos, the ski resort, which happens every year. It is a reminder, you've got a small number of 85 people, but if you like, with the hangers on, I mean, as represented in Davos, most of the 85 won't go there, but the representatives are there, governments will be there, heads of corporations.
Bono will be there,
But it's still a small number of people. It is a very tiny number of elite which are running the world's economy.
Yeah, and then it is, well, I mean, it's certainly the numbers are so small to be quite astonishing. I would put a small caveat on running the world's economy, because they don't know what they're doing either. They're in control, but they're not running it. In power, they have power, but not in office, so to speak. The other way around, office but no power.
And here we have a warning from Oxfam Well about instability and threats to democracy inside the world. I mean, on one level, you'd think at Davos the success story is democracy is spreading across the world, except free market.
Yes.
But are you worried about inequality sparking uncertainty?
Well, you don't have to ask me. Look at almost ever since 2008, if you look at, say, political risk reports in the Financial Times, the kind of big picture global politics that investment bankers and so on commission, the thing they keep going on about is political risk caused by austerity. There's been a lot of statistics showing that the flashpoints and riots and so on and mass demonstrations are linked to prices of basic commodities and foodstuffs going up. You cannot have global austerity without creating global flashpoints, and this is what we're seeing here.
Anindya, thank you. Now we're turning on a slightly lighter note to a story from Britain this week, where former Prime Minister Tony Blair was subject to an attempted citizen's arrest. The London Evening Standard says Tony Blair subjected to citizen's arrest by worker at London's Tramshed restaurant. Tony Blair was targeted in an attempted citizen's arrest last week as he dined with family and friends in a London restaurant. The former Prime Minister was reportedly confronted by a staff member who accused him of being a war criminal. Also from London, the Daily Mail says cheeky barman tried to put Tony Blair under a citizen's arrest for crimes against peace, while the former Prime Minister dined with his family in a trendy London restaurant. Tony Blair was dining with friends and family at Tramshed, East London, when DJ and barman Twiggy Garcia attempted arrest for crimes against peace. He was inspired to do so after reading arrestblair.org. The Mirror, which is pro-Labour generally, says Tony Blair threatens with citizen's arrest over Iraq war while having dinner in London's steak restaurant. Barman Twiggy Garcia said he noticed an eerie presence in the restaurant before realising Mr. Blair was among the customers. I put my hand on his shoulder and said, Mr. Blair, this is a citizen's arrest for a crime against peace, namely your decision to launch an unprovoked war in Iraq. I invite you to accompany me to a police station to answer the charge. From Northern Ireland, the Belfast Telegraph says former Prime Minister Tony Blair subjected to citizen's arrest at top London restaurant Tramshed over war in Iraq. The former Prime Minister has been haunted for almost a decade by the legacy of what many term an illegal war which saw up to 1 million Iraqis die and the country left ravaged by rival militia groups. While Blair is used to facing protests wherever he goes, he's never been ambushed in a social setting until now. The Independent carries a piece by Clive Baldwin headlined "Time to properly investigate UK war crimes in Iraq." Baldwin writes, whose advisor to Human Rights Watch says, a law firm and a leading international justice organisation jointly sent a 250-page submission to the International Criminal Court asking the prosecutors to open an investigation into alleged war crimes by UK nationals in Iraq, including possible responsibility of senior military and political figures. This is an interesting change, isn't it? I mean, a decade ago, Tony Blair was at the zenith of his power, absolutely there with George W. Bush, his friend in Washington. Now we have people go around saying he's an international war criminal and waiters in restaurants trying to arrest him.
Well, this story certainly brought a smile to my face. I mean, we were talking just now about this sort of 85, very small number of people that run the world, and Tony Blair is clearly in those circles and one of them. But you know, I just love the fact that every time he dares to visit Earth with his presence, my local manor, East London here, you know, he's just hated. Everybody comes out and people call him a war criminal, and you get protests wherever he goes, and now just like random waiters, this beautifully named Twiggy Garcia decides to have a collar him, and the contrast you draw is astonishing, because I remember in 1997, you know, having lived
when
through
Blair
the
was first elected.
Thatcher. I voted for Tony Blair with illusions. I thought this was a slick guy who was going to get rid of the Tories. You know, everyone loved him, and now he just can't go anywhere. And you know, Iraq will go to the grave with him. And I think I always smile. I think it's great that he can't go mix and lead a normal life without people trying to hold him to account. I think that's a great legacy of the anti-war movement from about 10 years ago.
That's an interesting point, because I mean, you sometimes hear the argument, well, 2 million people marched in London, millions marched across the globe against the invasion of Iraq back in 2000, but they didn't stop it, it didn't work. But there is a legacy there, is there not?
Absolutely, because the Project for a New American Century, Iraq was the starter course. It was meant to reconfigure the entirety of the Middle East. And while the anti-war movement and the resistance in Iraq did not manage to, you know, triumph in the way that Vietnam did, it certainly humiliated the states enough for it to cook up a stalemate and get out of there, and to kick out George Bush, get rid of this embarrassment of a president and bring in someone who at least can kind of present himself in public. And similarly, you know, Blair was, if you actually look at it, driven out over the war, in the same way that Thatcher was actually driven out over the poll tax. You know, you can
a rebellion against the taxing is unfair.
Indeed. And yeah, the guy deserves it. And
it's also interesting, because I recall when the former Chilean dictator General Pinochet was in London,
yes.
They had to hastily remove him because of the threat of prosecution for war crimes.
Yes.
There have been various attempts when Israeli politicians have been in Europe to actually serve them with try and arrest them for war crimes. I mean, this is a bit of a developing phenomenon, isn't it?
Yes,
that we're seeing from below, citizens attempting to implicate leaders of various states for war crimes.
Well, the moment you have a kind of official international tribunals for war crimes and so on, the moment this comes into the international legal system, well, that raises a question of justice, because the law in theory is meant to track an ideal of justice, and people see that. You know, they see various kind of, you know, people with dubious records around the world, petty dictators and militia leaders getting hauled up in front of court, and they quite rightly think, well, why isn't that happening to the 85, you know, and having a go themselves. And I think, you know, at the very least, it's an interesting commentary on the extent to which people know that the terrors of this world are the responsibility of a very small number of people, and we know who they are.
And going back to the report in The Independent about Britain, actually the attempt to take Britain to the International Criminal Court over British atrocities in Iraq. I mean, at the time, there was a kind of a narrative from the Brits that we were the people who knew how to do counterinsurgency. We've been in Northern Ireland.
Yes. Unlike these crass Americans who don't have their soft berets.
And now we have the reality of what the British did coming to light.
Yes, well, and quelle surprise to anyone who has seen the history of British imperialism over the past 200-300 years, you know. But the Sepoy mutiny there would tie people to cannons and blow them to shreds in India. So British imperialism equals war crimes, equals really quite horrible and nasty things. And I mean, you know, Clive Baldwin's from Human Rights Watch, I think he's entirely right to say that people should be in the dock. I'm not going to hold my breath about it happening, but he's quite right to say that.
And I mean, Iraq itself, we were talking about, I mentioned it earlier, I mean, this is a real mess. And really the West is almost, Britain and the United States have almost turned their back on Iraq, really. But they should take responsibility for the situation. Blair should be responsible. George W. Bush should be responsible for it.
I think the key issue is accountability. They should be held accountable for what they've done to those places. I mean, when they were responsible and in charge of it, they made a pretty poor job of it, so I wouldn't like them to be responsible. But they should be held accountable. And, you know, isn't that the problem that everyone faces, holding leaders to account? It's not a straightforward matter, but I certainly hope that happens.
And we are seeing, I mean, terrible sectarian violence inside Iraq at the moment. I mean, the responsibility for that, again, does that lie in the White House?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there was a unified national resistance in 2006 against the occupying forces, and America pretty much, you know, textbook counterinsurgency tactics, the sort of things it had done in Latin America, the sort of thing it had done in Lebanon, set up sectarian militias, got them to kill each other, divide and conquer. So the responsibility for that, and Britain, of course, yeah. So the responsibility, who created that situation in Iraq, which, by the way, I believe is likely to explode again this year. It's been quiet for a few years now, but things are going. I think they're going to kick off in Iraq again. Anindya
Bhattacharyya, thank you very much for joining us this week for this week's episode of Weekly Digest. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope you can join us again next week for another episode of Weekly Digest. Thank you.
Thank you.